When Aldrich ruminated on the fading of the fire, it inspired visions of a coming age of the deep sea. He knew that the path would be arduous, but he had no fear. He would devour the gods himself. How's it going, you wonderful people? I'm Jake the Ashen Hollow. In this video, we're going to be talking about the foundations of the Church of the Deep and how it became a belief system in which clerics forsook their duties to the flame to pursue. We know the idea and revelation of the Deep came from Aldrich when he was granted visions of it, but it takes more than just visions to push a religion that seems to have affected so many. I'd wager that the real driving force behind Aldrich and the Church of the Deep is none other than the ambitious Pontiff Sulyvahn. So let's backtrack a little bit and learn about the Pontiff, his upbringing, where he's been, and what could connect him to the Deep. The sorcery Snap Freeze reads, one of the spells left behind by the young sorcerer Sulyvahn before leaving the painted world. Sulyvahn was born and raised inside the painting, yet had little use for his frigid homeland since he had not yet experienced loss. Being from the painted world is certainly interesting, but not of any consequence. He was born there, so we know his mother called the painting her home. But what of his father? Who could he be directly, or who could he be associated with? I think the answer to that could be someone who shares quite a bit in common with Sulyvahn, and that's Gravelord Nito. And let me explain how. So while you could certainly associate Nito with bones and skeletons for obvious reasons, I'd say outside of the obvious, he's closely associated with eyes. The Gravelord Sword Dance miracle reads, miracle known only by the servants of the first dead Gravelord Nito. Nito sleeps deep within the giant catacombs, quietly overseeing all death and waiting for his servants to usher in the Eye of Death. And the Eye of Death reads, lure phantoms from other worlds. The dreadful eyes of death spread disaster across neighboring worlds. Phantoms lured to the host world may end up as victims, allowing the eyes of death to multiply and leading to further proliferation of bane. These eyes are meant to lure others into death, disaster, and chaos across different lands and worlds. But what does that have to do with Sulyvahn and his connection to Aldrich and the Deep? Well, the Pontiff had a very similar practice he bestowed upon his knights through his eye rings. The Pontiff's left and right eye rings read, bewitched ring that Pontiff Sulyvahn bestowed upon his knights. Knights who peer into the black orb are lured into battles of death, transformed into frenzied beasts. So, knights peering into these black-orbed eyes of the Pontiff are essentially doing the same thing as Nito's eyes of death, with the added benefit or drawback of turning them into beasts. Now, whether these eye-inspired beasts are the same kind that ravaged Astora mentioned in the Ring of the Evil Eye is a completely separate rabbit trail for another time. But to think of that connection shared between Nito and Sulyvahn certainly can't be coincidence, especially considering we clearly see Aldrich wielding some form of the Gravelord's sword. Now, the idea of Nito being Sulyvahn's father is far from a certainty, but it's fun to entertain when we consider the mother being in the painted world and the empty casket next to Nito that's widely assumed to be that of his mates. And the fact that Sulyvahn is derived from the Irish name Sullivan, which translates into Little Dark Eye, which could be indicative of a little Nito. But father or not, it isn't crazy to assume that Sulyvahn was associated with Nito and or his teachings in some way. Perhaps he himself could have been one of the Gravelord's servants at a time and helped Nito collect the Eyes of Death until he could replicate it himself. But I think the whole idea of it is important because we see Aldrich wield the Gravelord's power, and we can assume that the Pontiff is the driving force behind this bloated cleric. Furthermore, we see evidence of the Pontiff's involvement with Aldrich in the Deep by reading Pontiff Sulyvahn's Soul. Soul of Pontiff Sulyvahn. Pontiff Sulyvahn of Irithyll imprisoned a god of the old royalty in the abandoned cathedral to be fed to the devourer. The Pontiff wanted Aldrich to devour Gwendolyn, and I believe I know why. The Life Hunt Scythe miracle derived from Aldrich's soul reads, Aldrich dreamt as he slowly devoured the god of the dark moon. In this dream, he perceived the form of a young pale girl in hiding. The young girl likely being Priscilla, for as far as we know, she was the only one to possess the power of Life Hunt. This is what was important to the Pontiff, I believe. The gods feared the incredible power of the Life Hunt, which we learned in Dark Souls 1. If Aldrich possessed this power as well, game mechanics of us having to kill him aside, in theory, he'd probably become one of the most powerful beings in the world. On top of already devouring gods, he now held onto a power they feared the most. Then we have the small doll, which much like the doll in Dark Souls 1, allows its wielder to cross over a plane they would otherwise be unable to cross. Likely a trick Sulyvahn picked up in the painted world. The small doll reads, In the legendary old city of Irithyll, situated in the Boreal Valley, the Pontiff Sulyvahn gave this doll to valued subjects, so that they may use it to cross the barrier when they return home. We find the doll on the corpse of one of the Archdeacons of the Deep, so if the Pontiff gave this doll to an Archdeacon of the Deep, then he was one of the Pontiff's loyal subjects. Not to mention, in Irithyll itself, we see two of the Pontiff's beasts guarding the corpse of another of the Deep's Archdeacons, who allow us to serve Aldrich further if we wish. We also have to consider the fact that the deacons began using sorceries instead of miracles, which was considered a sin of their faith, which was likely passed down from Sulyvahn, who was a talented sorcerer. It's also interesting that the deacons of the Deep's robes and Pontiff Sulyvahn's each have what I suppose is a tabard over their robes that are similar in design. Even the Pontiff's own knights wield weapons affected by the Deep. The Pontiff Knight Curved Sword says, "Curved sword wielded by the Pontiff's knights, frigid spirits that linger in Irithyll. The large blade appears to be eaten away by insects, making it lightweight but also brittle." Now, what kind of insect could chew through a blade? Well, we know of one such insect that might just do the job. The Miracle Gnaw reads, "Dark miracle taught in the Cathedral of the Deep, summons insect swarm to feast on foes. These insects which lurk in the deep have tiny jaws lined with fangs to tear open the skin and burrow into the flesh in the blink of an eye, causing intense bleeding." Which could be further indication of the Pontiff's close association with the Deep, especially considering that the Deacons of the Deep once guarded the world against the creatures that dwelled there, but we'll get more into that later. Now we have to talk about what the word Pontiff means, which is simply the Pope. There is no other religion that Sulyvahn even appears closely related to other than the Deep, that he could be the frickin' Pope of. It's often believed that Aldrich is the head of or in charge of this religion, but I think not. Aldrich is referred to as the Saint of the Deep, a saint recognized as someone who has an exceptional degree of holiness or the closeness to a god. Aldrich was the figurehead of the Church of the Deep, the Jesus of the Deep, if you will, and Sulyvahn was, well, the Pope. Now that I've hopefully made sense of all that, we can look into how the Deep came about, what it is, and all that jazz. Originally, the deacons and clerics, and Aldrich likely as well, of the Cathedral of the Deep, were dedicated to the Way of White. The Archdeacon Holy Garb reads, "Holy garb worn by an Archdeacon of the Cathedral of the Deep, a sign of the Way of White's highest rank." So a pretty easy connection there. The deacons were in the cathedral to fight back the creatures of the Deep and seal them away. It seems that within the cathedral was some sort of, portal or gateway to and from the Deep, and it's why they were stationed there to guard it. As the Deep Ring states, "In the cathedral slumber things most terrible, and as such the deacons require a grand narrative to ensure they do not falter in their duty. A philosophy to ward away the madness beckoned by the grotesqueries at hand." So it's likely that the cathedral was intentionally built around this spot to contain an offensive against the Deep, so that it could not threaten the flame. We can even see inside the cathedral how grotesque things are, but they could not fight forever. The deacon robes read, "Robe worn by the deacons of the Cathedral of the Deep. The deep red pigment denotes the blessing of fire. In time, those dedicated to sealing away the horrors of the Deep succumbed to their very power. It seems that neither tending to the flame nor the faith could save them. It's likely the same fall to the horrors of the Deep that inspired Aldrich to begin his process of devouring people for power and eventually gods. We know that during this time many bloody battles took place within the cathedral between the deacons and the beasts of the Deep, perhaps even the Pontiff's knights as well, considering the Deep insects that chewed through their steel. So much death, in fact, that there were those tasked with disposing of the dead. The Grave Warden robes read, "Attire of Grave Wardens at the Cathedral of the Deep. Grave Wardens were tasked with disposing of the ever-rising corpses that plagued the cathedral. Their clothes are utterly putrid, drenched in the blood and mucilage of their undertaking." But what is the Deep? It's hard to say for sure, but I believe it's the place that souls and humanity and everything in between goes when people die. Because it had to go somewhere, right? The Great Deep Soul Sorcery reads, "Archdeacon MacDonald, a sorcerer himself, delighted in the cathedral's stagnating souls. For him, they represented the glorious bedrock of this world. The stagnating souls are likely from all the fallen deacons and beasts as the war within the cathedral raged on. These souls departed from their owners' bodies, simply began to stagnate within the Deep, and we of course know that in the Dark Souls universe, souls are the key to power. And as these souls stagnated within the Deep, they collected larger and larger numbers, thus from where the power of the Deep draws its strength. The human Dreg's description says, Dregs are the heaviest thing within the human body and will sink to the lowest depths imaginable, where they become the shackles that bind this world. The dregs seemed likely to be whatever was left of people's souls or humanity as it slowly sank into what would become known as the Deep. And as we know, it eventually became corrupted and corrupted those who were tasked with guarding it. It's only when Aldrich ruminated on the fading of the flame that he was dedicated to protect, that he witnessed the true potential and power of the depths he had been fighting against, and he witnessed the age of the deep waters, made from the viscous liquid sediment that remained from the souls of the lost. He shared his vision with Sulyvahn, who sought power above all else. Thus, the Church of the Deep was formed by those the world thought kept them safe from it. Their miracles became sorceries reflecting the power of the deep and the dregs that stagnated there. Aldrich began to devour and devour until he bloated himself so much that he turned into black sludge, likely in some ways a sort of dreg himself. Before long, however, he and all of his might was tossed upon the flame by those who still served the fire and wished to see its age flourish. But alas, the bells would once again toll, and Aldrich would not follow his duty to the fire, but continue his dreams of the deep and devour the god of the dark moon to gain the all-powerful Life-Hunt ability. Guarded by Sulyvahn and his knights, they bide their time to find a way to usher in the age of the deep seas. Now, I know there's a lot more questions and information about the deep, and I plan on creating another video that covers more of that, and more specifically gets into the details about the 3 archdeacons in the near future. I simply wanted this video to cover how the Church of the Deep came to be, and truth be told, it was quite difficult not to go down the thousands of rabbit trails that are connected to this information overload. So keep your eyes peeled in the coming weeks for that next video, as we know there's a lot more to the Cathedral than mentioned here, such as Rosaria and shit like that. Either way, I want to thank you a ton for watching, and I hope that you've enjoyed the video. If you haven't already subscribed, I hope that you will, and be sure to ring that bell icon for notifications for new videos. Be sure to follow me on Twitter for reasons, and if you want to support the channel further, consider checking out my Patreon page for how to do so. Thanks again, everyone. Peace out!